Welcome to the Diet Doctor Podcast with Dr. Brett Scher. Today I'm joined by Dan Scholnick from Trinity Ventures. Now this is a little bit of a different guest because he's involved in venture capital, but what makes him such a great guest is he has his own personal journey like so many of us, but he started off as a kid with hypercholesterolemia, and he's going to tell you about his story. He's also had problems with energy and fatigue, then came across this guy named Dave Asprey as a budding entrepreneur, but didn't buy into the low-carb scene until he heard Gary Taubes speak. And then all of a sudden he became a fan of low-carb. And so what I loved talking to Dan about was not only his personal journey, but then how he transitioned as to an investor in Bulletproof, which has its positives and negatives, and we talk about both sides of the company, but also what that means in terms of his vision for what Silicon Valley's role is in health investment, what their role is in trying to find the next big thing. So we talk about lab-grown meats, we talk about hydroponic vegetables, we talk about just trying to make agriculture more productive and more efficient. And we try and tie it all in to get his perspective on just what his role is, what Silicon Valley's role is, and what we as the general population can hope to get out of Silicon Valley and health in the future. So I hope you find this an interesting and a little bit different interview, that you still come away with some great little pearls to learn and kind of help you understand this world a little bit better. So enjoy this interview with Dan Scholnick from Trinity Ventures. Dan Scholnick, welcome to the Diet Doctor Podcast. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So we were talking a little bit offline, and I didn't realize just how great of a candidate to interview you are. I was looking for the business side of the low-carb world, and I came across you because you had a personal history with low-carb and are involved in the business and investment side of low-carb. But it goes even deeper than that. You've got familial hypercholesterolemia, you're a hyper responder. These are hot topics. So I look forward to discussing all this with you today. So if you could start, give us a little background on your first experiences with low carb and maybe how that transitioned into an investment strategy.
You know, it started in 2010. I mean, actually, the story goes back to when I was 10 years old. I mean, that's when it really started. And that was when, it was probably around that time, so this is in the 80s, that my sister and I have a younger sister, were diagnosed with high cholesterol, which ran in the family. And I was told, and this is important context, we were put on drugs, cholesterol-lowering medication back then. Yeah, you're giving me a surprised look. But yes. And I think back to that and think, oh my God, what were we?
This must have been Mevacor. I think that was the only statin.
We were taking, it wasn't a statin, we were taking equestrian.
Oh, wow.
Which, like, getting like a 10 or 12-year-old to put that powder in your thick, like you had this thick, we'd mix it in orange
mix it
juice.
Up and drink it.
We'd mix it in orange juice. I mean, God, it's like that, just like thinking about it, that taste comes back into my mouth and I want to vomit. Sorry. And we were told to follow a very strict diet, and you can guess.
Low fat, high carb diet.
Yeah. So I was told less than 10 grams of saturated fat a day. There was nothing said about carbs. It was just don't eat fat,
right?
Or cholesterol. So no eating cholesterol, no eating fat.
But eat anything else you want.
Eat anything else you want. So
right.
I was like a kid and was like, oh, well, bread, this piece of bread doesn't have any fat or cholesterol, so I can go to town on this loaf of bread. Or like these gummy bears, they don't have fat or cholesterol, so I can go to town. And what were all those like cookies that they came out with back then that didn't have fat but had
like Snackwells.
And anyway, fast forward, 2010. I'm here as the general partner at Trinity Ventures, and we invite this guy who had worked at one of our portfolio companies in the past to come be an entrepreneur in residence with us. And this is somebody who's, transitioning in their career, and they hang out with us for a while we help them find the next thing they're going to do. And that guy was Dave Asprey. Dave would walk around our office with plates, like a plate of food that would have a stick of butter, a pile of smoked salmon, and like an avocado. And when we were all eating our sandwiches for lunch, Dave would be sitting there like chowing down on a stick of butter.
And you looked at that and said, I'm having a heart attack just watching you
Exactly.
eat that. That was your
yeah.
mindset,
And
right?
I would literally make fun of him.
Yeah.
I would, it's like, you're a crazy man. What are you doing? Like, what is this? Nobody eats a stick of butter. And finally one day I was feeling really bad about it. And I went over to his office and I said, Dave, why don't we schedule some time to sit down and you can tell me what this thing you're doing is all about, and like why you're walking around with a stick of butter all the time. And so that was my first introduction to low carb. We actually sat down in a conference room and he walked me through all of it.
Wow.
And my response was, this is insanity. And I mean, you can understand this because
because of the way you were brought up and the way you were taught by doctors over and over again, and
exactly.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's a common story for all of us. It's like it's hard to unlearn 30 years or 40 years of training or brainwashing or propaganda or whatever you want to call it.
It's the same for doctors as it is for everyday people.
Absolutely. Yeah. It just so happened at the time Dave was running a nonprofit here in the Bay Area, and the next day. They were running an event, and this guy named Gary Taubes was giving a talk.
I've heard of him.
And so Dave said, like, look, don't believe me if you don't want to. Just do me one favor. And he said, I want you to come to this event tomorrow night. I went and I saw Gary speak, and it blew my mind, the work that he had done. And this was probably around the time of Good Calories, Bad Calories.
Right.
And I started thinking, what if everything that I was told about what was good for me to eat and bad for me to eat and what was going on with my cholesterol was based on faulty science? And I've been taking these drugs for decades. Could this be doing damage to me?
It's a rude awakening, huh?
It was a very powerful moment. And I went down the rabbit hole. I like to think I'm sophisticated enough not to get like hoodwinked by charismatic people, so I want to do my own research. And so I read everything Gary had written, and then I read all of the rebuttals to Gary's work. Like then I ended up at the China study.
Right.
And I read the China study, and then I read all the rebuttals to the China story. So my point is I went deep.
Right.
And after doing a lot of research, I came to the conclusion that, and this is 8 years ago, but that there was still a lot that we didn't know, that the ideas and the science that Gary and Dave and other folks in the community were talking about was on the right side of history.
So were you able to then say, okay, I'm buying in and I'm jumping in and I'm going to go for this low carb lifestyle, or was there still so much trepidation that you sort of like just had to dip your foot in the water first before you could jump in because of, that sort of governor in your brain saying, remember what you've been taught?
Yeah. I mean, there was a little bit of everything. So the thing that Dave convinced me to do was to run experiments. And Dave is still a biohacker. But he was an early biohacker, and that's how he approaches everything. And what he convinced me of, and what I became convinced of after I did all this research was that we do have a lot of tools available to us to change the way that we're feeling and different attributes of our lives. Some of the science is still pretty early, so you have to experiment. And so that's because there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all. So what Dave convinced me to do was start experimenting. And so the first thing I experimented with, what happens if I just cut out carbs altogether? And it was for the first month when I sat there looking at a plate of eggs and bacon and a cup of coffee with butter in it. Every time I went to eat that stuff, I just had this feeling like I am killing myself right now. And that's why I totally I empathize with people who are trying to change their diet and lifestyle in any way, because that conditioning is so ingrained, it's very hard to change.
Yeah, so psychologically, I could see how that was very challenging for you. But I read how physically it was actually pretty beneficial for you, that you had this history of sort of chronic fatigue, being always feeling tired and down, and that started to improve. Is that the case? How long did it take until that started to improve? And how did that impact your psychological barrier once you started to feel better physically?
Yeah, just to give a little bit more context, I mean, energy issues were something that I had dealt with from a very young age, and just feeling tired all the time, and to the point where it was extreme enough that that other people noticed. It only came to my awareness, maybe when I was in middle school or something like that, or high school, when a teacher pulled me aside and said, Dan, you seem tired all the time. Like, what's up with that? And maybe you should try exercising. I don't want to say that it was the low-carb diet by itself that helped me feel a lot better from an energy perspective, and helped kind of reduce the amount of fatigue that I feel every day. And by the way, it's still something I struggle with today, but it's a lot better than it used to be. Mm-hmm. But it was that concept that Dave introduced to me of biohacking and experimenting. And so that sent me down. I started with this path of trying low carb and trying to figure out what it would do to my cholesterol, my lipid profile. And then I started thinking, what else could I start to experiment around? That became energy issues. I noticed how low carb was helping energy. I started introducing supplements. I started making other lifestyle modifications. At the time I was using a Zeo, which was a sleep monitor that was the very best on the market at the time, so I could see what was happening during my sleep cycle. I was experimenting with energy. I was keeping detailed logs of everything about how I felt. I mean, it was a lot of work. I don't want to lie about that. What came out the other end was transformational, in that for the first time in my life, I had days where I didn't feel any fatigue at all. That alters your reality,
right?
In a really profound way. And it was very emotional. I even get emotional right now, like just thinking about what that transformation was like, because it really changes you.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's sort of what I was getting at with the question, because we do have this big population now, this community of hyper responders. And one thing that's fairly consistent among them is they almost all say, yeah, but I feel so good. My LDL's up, but I feel so good. And that can help reframe your psychology. If you felt awful doing it, or you didn't feel any better doing it, it would be a non-issue. But it's because people feel so good with this lifestyle and they see so many other benefits that it makes it hard to want to change. So I guess that's where I was going with you. If that impacted your psychology of looking at the eggs and bacon and your butter and your coffee. But now it sounds like that wasn't a long-term solution for you. Fast forward.
Yeah, and by the way, I think maybe you left out the context from our offline discussion, which was that I am a hyper responder,
right.
Which means that when I go on a high-fat diet, my LDL-C and my LDL-P rise substantially. And it's not clear, and I'm happy to get into the details of this, but in my case, it's not clear whether that's good or bad. I will say that what makes it difficult is that what makes this whole thing challenging for me in figuring out what's the right thing for me to do is that I do feel better on a low-carb diet. But it's unclear what the impact on the lipid side of this is, in terms of whether it's good or bad, and am I doing more harm or less harm? So what I'm doing now is experimenting with different diets to see what kind of trade-offs I can make in terms of what's happening in my lipid profile versus how I'm feeling.
Okay, that makes sense.
At the end of the day, if you put a gun on my head, I'd probably say I'd rather feel better more of the time and risk the high LDL-C and LDL-P than walk around feeling tired and depressed all the time.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. And that's something that I deal with a lot with the clients I see and the number of people in this hyper responder community. It's the trade-off of feeling great for something that some people say might be detrimental down the road, but we actually really don't know. But we don't have the reassurance to know it's safe 100% either. And it's an interesting place to be in. But I could talk to you about this all day long.
I guess if I can just interject for a second,
Sure.
I think everybody has to make every individual has to make their own decision on this matter, and because we just don't have all the science yet, we don't have all the information, and so I think it's the responsibility of anybody who is a hyper responder to become informed, and so that they can make an informed decision and try to trade off the risks of whatever path they choose.
Absolutely. Yeah. But then, so rewinding to meeting Dave Asprey, going to the talk with Gary Taubes, then all of a sudden you put your money where your mouth is, literally, and made an investment in Bulletproof.
It's a great story. I don't know how much there is to learn from it. But, we obviously here at Trinity, we had a deep relationship with Dave, and he really opened up our eyes to this trend that was on the right side of history. And in the meantime, I think it was probably in 2010 that he bought this web domain, bulletproofexec.com, and he and Lana, his wife, were publishing the Better Baby book. And then he started blogging about his biohacking journey on bulletproofexec.com, and we just by that time, Dave had really become my health and wellness guru or mentor, and I started becoming a bit of a business coach to Dave, because what was happening is the traffic to his website was building, and Bulletproof is an amazing story because it just kind of grew organically from that. He was working another job at the time, but more and more people were coming to the website, and they started asking him for products, and so he started referring them to other companies to buy things. He started making some money off of affiliate sales, and then he started thinking, I could make better products than what I'm referring people to, and so he started making his own products. And so this whole time, over the course of years, it was like the snowball rolling down the hill, getting bigger and bigger, and it got to a point where Bulletproof is becoming a substantial company, and Dave decided to quit his job and focus on it full time, and also decided that he needed to raise capital to facilitate the expansion of the business. And obviously, I had a front row seat as he was doing all of that because of our relationship. So it was a very natural, even though this is not what I typically invest in. We were talking earlier about how I mostly invest in deep technologies like cloud computing and other infrastructure software that's probably not interesting to your audience. We felt compelled to invest in Bulletproof.
And at the same time, this was happening in a atmosphere where I think it was you who said every investor in Silicon Valley is on some sort of a low-carb diet. Like, it was low-carb was sort of taking Silicon Valley by storm. And I find it curious, how people can say, I think this is going to be the next big thing to invest in, especially something like Bulletproof, or like we were talking about, something like a fasting mimicking diet, or basically things that people can do on their own. They don't require a product to do it. But yet, in some cases, it seems worth the investment to invest in a company just to do it a little bit better or a little bit more convenient for something that's a hot topic. And obviously, as you said, you thought it was on the right side of history. So you expected this to just take off, both as a low-carb community, low-carb trend, low-carb movement, and the specific product. But was there a little bit of concern that, well, look, anybody can put a slab of butter in their coffee. Why do I want to invest in a company that's promoting something that's so simple to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, there was a lot of controversy around our investment in BulletProof and every aspect of it. And, we had vigorous debates within our partnership here about putting money in, and even some of our investors, after we made the investment, scratched their head and said, okay, these guys at Trinity have just gone off the rails. Like, what are they doing? Because, even this was, I think, in 2014 that we first invested. And the world has changed a lot even since 2014, right? This was leading edge stuff and kind of crazy stuff 4 years ago. And people are not surprised anymore when you start talking about low carb. So it's much bigger than it was. We actually, even though I don't personally haven't invested in a lot of consumer retail companies, Trinity has a long history of doing it. And we were the first investors in Starbucks, for example. And you could say the exact same thing about Starbucks. They're just selling coffee, right? I mean, anybody else can make coffee. BulletProof is selling you coffee with some butter and some oil. Anybody can do that. Why invest in BulletProof? And ultimately, this is going to maybe sound like a weird answer to you, and maybe you'll find it unsatisfying. I don't know. But with a lot of these companies, it's not what we're not investing in. We're not investing in the product. We're investing in the brand, which is really about the trust that the company has built with its consumer audience. People went and go to Starbucks because they trust that when they go to Starbucks, they're going to have a certain experience and get a certain quality coffee. And in the space that the market that BulletProof is in, which is in this kind of leading edge health and wellness area, there is a lot of FUD out there. There are a lot of snake oil salesmen.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of bad product, and it's a confusing landscape. That we're only in the beginning of on the learning curve of understanding. And so, what Dave did effectively at BulletProof was build a brand that became a trusted source of guidance and information about how to achieve a higher level of human performance. And so when you look at BulletProof, you can trust, and our consumers trust, that the coffee they're getting from us, for example, the coffee beans are high quality, and that the oils are what we say they are, and they're differentiated. And they're also looking for the advice on, how do I just make sense of all of this complexity out here? What should I do?
Yeah.
And so that's the brand experience that we're investing in. It's not about, because you're right, you could go out tomorrow and start a coffee company. That's not hard, but
what's going to differentiate you from all the others?
And that brand. I mean, look at what a big company Starbucks has become over. We invested in it in 1989.
I'm guessing that worked out pretty well for you guys.
that worked out great. But that brand, that relationship with the customer is it's durable, and it ends up being your source of competitive advantage.
Interesting. Yeah, and BulletProof, for all that it is, also has a lot of detractors and people who sort of frown upon it. And, some claims have been made that could be hard to defend, that, all you have to do is drink this coffee and you're going to start burning fat right away, or you can boost your IQ 20 points. I mean, there's a point where you can you cross the line. As you said, there's a lot of snake oil out there. And even if it's a good product, you can over promote it to a degree. It may be a tough question for you to answer, but is there any concern about crossing that line with the company?
This is something we think about and talk about in board meetings all the time.
Yeah.
First principles for me and for us investing in the company were that, we did our own research. As I described, I went down the rat hole on this stuff and came to the conclusion that the work that Dave and the team at BulletProof on the scientific side, the work that they were doing was sound, based on the best available information that was out there, and that the products really were what the company says they are. I think that I don't want to give a cop-out answer, but some of this is hard because you're trying to you're trying to change the world. Like there's really a mission, I think, behind Bulletproof and even what you're doing, right? Even with this podcast and a diet doctor and whatnot. I mean, we're trying to help people get healthier.
Right.
It's there's a profit motive too, but it's almost secondary to the greater mission. And if you want to reach the most people possible, you want to do it in the easiest language that with the clearest communication that they can understand. It's something that Dave is really good at.
Yeah.
And I love Gary Taubes, for example, but normal human beings aren't going to consume the book Good Calories, Bad Calories.
He likes
right?
to joke how thick it is.
Yeah, and he's what he does is so important, but that's not going to become mainstream, right?
Yeah.
So I think some of this is you're trying to figure out, and he's written books since, I think he got that feedback, and he's written books since then that are more easily digestible by a mainstream audience. But part of it is I think there's some experimentation that Bulletproof has had to do to figure out what the right communication style is. And then frankly, I mean, if I'm just being honest, the early days of the company was a little bit of the Wild West, right? It wasn't built intentionally with the business in mind. It was this thing that kind of built up organically.
Yeah.
And there was this team of people spread out all over the country that were working on it with Dave, right? And so I think if you look at the company is much more professionalized today.
Okay.
And that's part of what came with our investment in the company. And so that's part of what we were trying to do.
Yeah, it clearly built a big community. And as with anything, though, it gets maybe misinterpreted in the general sphere. Like you can't eat your high-carb diet and drink a Bulletproof coffee and think you're going to be burning fat and be healthy. Like It doesn't work that way. But yet sometimes that's the way people interpret the message. And, frequently if someone comes with a high cholesterol or they're not losing weight on a low-carb diet, one of the first things we have to do is take them off that Bulletproof coffee. So it's not all roses, but it's got its place. And I guess the point is that the marketing sometimes can confuse that, but that's business, right?
Yeah, and I think it's just part of what's hard about this is how much complexity there is in all of this stuff. You and I were talking about beforehand. We're trying to change, very complex human systems, and most people are not going to have the time or motivation to get into the weeds of it as you've done or I've done or Peter Attia's done at an even more extreme level, right? And so I guess another way of looking at it is, let's say somebody is drinking Bulletproof coffee, but they're still eating lots of carbs and they're not losing weight. But let's say that Bulletproof coffee is making them feel like $1 million in the morning and they didn't feel like $1 million before. It's a win. And if nothing else, maybe it's starting to get them down this journey, this path of realizing that that the food they eat, the lifestyle they live actually does have an impact on how they feel. Yeah. And maybe some of them then want more of that. And they're willing to go work with folks like you. And look, we'll take that win, right? Yeah. Because it is moving people in the right direction.
All right. But then there's the broader concept of this, what's next in this market, in this sphere. And, there's supplements, $30 billion in the United States alone, and talk about the Wild West and snake oil and no limitations on what you can say and what you can promote. I mean, that's sort of a dangerous area, but now Silicon Valley is getting more involved in that as well.
I'm using a startup right now that makes custom supplements based on your genetic profile and your blood test. So I'm just validating that yes, this stuff is going on, and I'll try anything. So I try these things and see how it goes.
Right. So the N of one experimenter, but it's much harder to say, yes, take this, it's going to improve your brain function. Yes, take this, it's going to make you a superhuman. When, again, it sort of falls back on get regular exercise, get sun exposure, get plenty of sleep, eat a good diet, and that's going to do the heavy lifting. You can take whatever supplements you want. If you're not doing those things, it's not going to make a difference. But what do you see as sort of like the next thing on the horizon for health-related VC investments we're going to be talking about in 6 months from now?
One thing that jumps to mind, which I think people are already talking about, is the psychological side of all of this. And there's been a lot of investment in meditation apps and other types of programs. I think we have one in our portfolio called 10% Happier, which perhaps you've heard of. We just invested in it. This is a very early stage company that's helping people better manage their marital relationships or relationships with their life partners. I think probably people like you and me spend a lot of time talking about the science and the drugs and the supplements and the diets and all those kinds of things, but there's a mental health aspect of this too that is also related to diet and supplements and drugs and all of those kinds of things, but it's also something that can be worked on independently. And I think the startups that are working in those areas are seeing tremendous demand. There's still stigmas attached to thinking, doing things about mental health, going to see a therapist, meditating, things like that. And the fact that now you can do these things on your mobile phone in the privacy of your own home, it kind of changes the game. I know fasting is something that you've brought up, and a lot of the community is interested in now. It definitely seems, from what I understand of the science, which is still pretty rudimentary, but there's some strong evidence that there's real health benefits to fasting. And so we've funded a very early stage company that's going to help folks with fasting programs. So those are the types of things. Those are certainly the types of things that are coming up and that we're seeing.
Yeah, I can see that. That's going to, fasting is fascinating though, because how can you make money off of telling people not to eat? You're not selling anything. You're taking something away. So it's more about like the community and the coaching and the helping people through it. Is it?
Yeah, it's no different than the meditation programs, for example, which is, in theory, with all of this stuff, you can do it on your own, right? Like I can go buy coffee, put butter in it, buy some MCT oil, stick it in, blend it, right? I don't need somebody to do that for me. I can, sit in the corner of the room here, close my eyes, and I can meditate.
But the question is, will you?
Yeah, and will I? And so, a lot of these things, some of it is education, and a lot of it is really about convenience and behavioral change, and having support when you're doing those things is real helpful. Think about why Weight Watchers is such a big business. You can go on a diet. Yeah. You can count your calories.
Sure.
But Weight Watchers is a big business because there's value to having somebody help you go on that diet program.
And then you can gain it all back later. But that's another story.
Right.
So one of the other hot topics, it seems like, in terms of the future of nutrition and health and venture capital is fake meat, lab-grown meat. Tyson Ventures led a $2.2 million round for an Israeli-based future meat technology. Cargill and Tyson invested in Memphis Meats, which is right here in Silicon Valley, lab-grown meats. And Merck, the drug company Merck, led an $8.8 million round for Mosa Meat, which is now a pharma-backed lab-cultured meat. And Bill Gates and Richard Branson are all getting on board. Although at the present moment, a pound of cell-cultured meat takes $2,400 to make, basically. Oh, man, this subject has so many different things. One, the cost standpoint. Two, what are we actually eating? What's actually in it? And three, this is based on the fact that, the concept that meat is bad and horrible for the environment, which is a very sort of kind of dumbed down argument without a lot of nuance. But then it seems to be hot and people are investing in it. So how do you kind of incorporate all that and say, as an investor, is this something that's going to take off and something where you would want to back?
Yeah. Part of it is Silicon Valley is always chasing the next big idea.
Yeah.
And it does seem, it does appear that there is the world is going to be facing a big challenge with meat consumption if we don't figure this out in some way. And I hear you that it's nuanced and whatnot, but as more of the world gets lifted out of poverty and more people start eating meat, and then also more people start demanding high quality, healthy, clean meat, we're going to have to find new ways to support that kind of infrastructure because the type of farming that's being done today is not sustainable. And so I think that the investors looking at this, the entrepreneurs starting these companies, are that's what they're going after. They're saying, this is a big idea because this is a huge challenge that the world is facing, and whoever can solve this problem could stand to both, do a lot of good in the world and make a lot of money at the same time. And who wouldn't want to do that, right? I think that there would be a lot of consensus that if you could build a company that could grow meat in a low-cost, sustainable way, that company would be very valuable. So we all agree that would be, if I could put $1 in that today, someday in the future I might get millions of dollars out. That's very exciting. It's just a question of when.
Yeah.
Is that 2 years from now? And is that 10 or 15 or 20 years from now? And this is where you get into some of the art of investing and not the science, because nobody has that perfect crystal ball to say these things are going to work in 2 years. Our best guess right now is that it is further out on the time scale, in the 5 to 10 year type of time frame, not the 0 to 5 year type of time frame, until these things become really commercially available at a price point and a quality level that is going to make you, buy XYZ lab grown meat instead of the ribeye from your, the grass-fed ribeye from your local sustainable farm.
Right.
So, we think it's further out. So when we make that assessment, we'll wait. And, so we haven't made an investment in that area.
I mean, I think the comparison that you made is a good comparison. So I had to say, let's find ways to get more of the local grass-fed farms. Let's find more ways to improve the way we raise ruminants and bring them to market. And let's find ways to improve that productivity and with regenerative agriculture help nature rather than hurt it. But that's sort of a harder sell because that's not technology. That's not as easily scalable. That's not as change the world type of mentality, I think. And that's where I think Silicon Valley focuses more on the lab culture meats maybe and less on the sort of the real meats.
for sure. I mean, but to maybe either make an excuse or explain Silicon Valley a little bit.
Yeah.
It's our job here to fund the wacky, crazy, big ideas that might not work. I mean, that is the business model of Silicon Valley. If you look at a venture fund like ours, most of our companies are not going to work. We're probably going to lose our money. We might be lucky to get it back. But then you get but then one of those companies is Starbucks.
Right.
And nothing else you did matters, right?
Right.
And so, if one of these lab-grown meat companies works and achieves the potential that the investors, the founders think it can meet, it was a risk worth taking. Or something in their portfolio does that, then it was, that basket of risk made sense. There are other types of businesses like what you just described that deserve funding that will get it from other places, just not Silicon Valley. It's not our job in the world. And I think that's okay. There's a lot of criticism of Silicon Valley, and I get why, but we are not the only source of funding in the world. We are a specific source of funding for a specific type of company and idea. And it's a big world that's awash in capital, and so there are other ways to get the kind of sustainable farming movement funded. It's not what Silicon Valley is built to do.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be great if Silicon Valley got into that? I mean, wouldn't that help so much more?
Look, I'm a believer in specialization, right? And maybe it would be great if a farming area. Maybe the Central Valley in California should get really into that.
Yeah.
And I think money from Silicon Valley does end up out in those places. And there's a lot of people in Silicon Valley who invest money in these types of causes or donate money to these types of causes. But I don't think that it's Silicon Valley's responsibility to do everything.
I guess that makes sense. Yeah.
But I mean, that's just my point of view. But it's a big country, like,
And Silicon Valley is not one place either. It's
That's
so
right.
many different companies and so many different mindsets.
And what we know is tech, right? That's we don't know farming, but there are lots of people out there that really know farming.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting that Merck made such a big investment, because that, almost from a publicity standpoint, just sounds awful to have a pharmaceutical company involved in making your meat. To me, just does not sound very good. And it brings up the questions of like regulations. Like, how do you regulate this? Is it food? Is it a drug? Is it a supplement? What is it? And I think that's going to be something that can really impact whether investors see return on their capital or not, depending on how this is regulated and who regulates it. I don't know if you have any insight into that, because it's not really...
I mean, if I did, I don't know how you would have insight into that, because there's so many unknowns there. I don't invest in this area, so I don't know if the government is looking at it. But it's just another. When we're making investments like this, we list all the risks, and then we look at what the reward could be if it works.
Yeah.
Right. And then everyone has to make their own judgment. Does the reward justify all the risks you're taking there? So everything you're saying is legitimate.
Is there something similar around like hydroponic vegetables? And that doesn't get as much news attention, I don't think, but are you aware of any big startups around that?
I am. Yeah. I mean, I've seen a couple startups that are doing agriculture, plant-based agriculture in shipping containers, for example.
And that's Elon Musk's brother, I think, is doing some of that.
Yeah, and there's a few companies doing that. And I that to me seems like a great idea. Less risky than doing lab-grown meat, because you're not changing the biology. You're still growing plants, but you're just growing plants like we always have. You're just doing it at higher density, and just resource intensity of the current agricultural system is huge. I forget what percentage of the world's land is dedicated to agriculture, but it's huge. I mean, it's probably something like, I'm making up numbers now, but I mean, it's probably something like 60, 70% or something like that. Maybe of the places that have been like habitable land or something like that.
Okay.
And if you so
but
even if it's 20 or 30%, it's huge.
It's still a lot. And what it's doing to the land is awful. Like, it's destroying the soil.
And you're using all these resources. Like in California, for example, there's this constant fight between the Central Valley and the coastal cities about water. Right.
Yeah.
And so what these farms inside of shipping containers are doing is making a hyper efficient, low resource intensity version of farming. So I met one company that could grow as many strawberries in a shipping container as you could grow in something like 3,000 acres of land.
Wow.
And part of that is because you have soil depletion, and you have to move crops around and things like that, so you can only use sections of it at a time, and they can do it year round, 24/7, and you can stack these things vertically, right?
Right.
So I think there's some really cool ideas there. I think whether they'll work as businesses is hard to say, but I'm glad people are taking those risks, making those bets. Yeah,
it changes the resource. It makes it a more lights and electricity resource as opposed to land resource, and monocropping is definitely not good for the country.
Yeah, and it's even more, it's more complex and nuanced than even that, because the water usage, for example, is a lot more efficient.
Right. You can recycle the use of the water. And,
exactly.
And it doesn't evaporate as much.
Exactly.
Right. And by the way, I feel awful that I called Kimball Musk Elon Musk's brother. I have to correct myself. He's got a name. He's got his own thing. He stands on his own 2 feet. That was not respectful of me to say. But anyway. All right. Now I've got to ask you about something. I read that you started a bagel company called Schmendrick's. Is that right?
I did.
So this guy who's had a low-carb journey starts a bagel company.
I'm into low-carb. Here are my bagels. So I started my wife and a couple friends and I started this business. I forget what year. but we started because you live on the West Coast. I'm guessing you hear this in San Diego all the time, but the common refrain in San Francisco is there are no good bagels in San Francisco, and so
all the East Coasters say that you can't get good bagels. That just goes in one ear and out the other.
Yeah,
for
we
me,
East Coasters, and I'm from the Boston area,
Yeah.
and our friends we did this with were from New York, and we were lamenting the fact that there were no good bagels and why, and there are all these theories, right? It's the water. So we set out to prove that you could make a high quality bagel in San Francisco. There was nothing special about New York, and so we actually managed to reverse engineer our favorite New York bagel and then sell it very successfully here in San Francisco, and the business was thriving. My wife, who was primarily running it because I'm otherwise employed as a venture capitalist, shut it down for really two reasons. I mean, one, it was during this period that we met Dave, started to experiment with low-carb lifestyle and the low-carb diet. And, we did start to have some serious concerns that the products we were selling, even though they were really delicious, were not healthy for folks. More importantly, my wife discovered, this is interesting. She discovered she had a gluten allergy. But it's like until you start learning about all this stuff, you don't really know, right? It was just something that she had, like my fatigue was part of my life.
Right.
I didn't know any other reality. She didn't know any other reality except feeling some like GI distress when she ate. It's just for her it was eating.
Right.
Just for me, like existing was being tired.
Right.
And so Dave and low carb and all this opened up our eyes to this idea that what you put in your body really matters, and it's complex, and you should experiment. So we discovered this thing. So that's ultimately why we ended up. She decided to shut the business down.
Which is incredibly responsible, because I think maybe 95% of businessmen would say, and businesswomen would say, if this is a thriving business, health be darned, let's keep making money. I mean, it's a difference between being a business person and being a socially responsible business person. So I think that makes for a great story and a happy ending.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to say that bagels are socially irresponsible, though. I don't want to end with that message. I think like a bagel,
I'll say it.
A bagel, an occasional bagel is, if it's a good bagel, is probably not the end of the world.
Well, now can you produce a New York bagel quality keto bagel? That would be the question.
We have talked about that. We can't imagine how that would be possible.
Okay. Worth it, though. Come on.
If we can do it, if we can find a way, I promise you we will.
All right. Very good. I will definitely keep my eyes open for that. Well, Dan, this has been a great talk. I really enjoyed it. Any other last words? And of course, if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you and get in touch with you?
Well, my profile is at the Trinity Ventures website, which is just trinityventures.com. I'm pretty easy to get in touch with, but I get a lot of emails. So the best way to get in touch with me is to find someone who knows me. So look on LinkedIn, because I'm pretty well connected, so you can usually find a way in. I think the only thought I'd leave is just going back to something we talked earlier, which is that, what I've learned through all of this is you can really, this stuff is important. Low carb is important, but more importantly, this concept of that we can actually use diet and other lifestyle modifications to improve the way we feel, improve our health, improve our longevity. It's very real. And I would encourage anyone who has interest in it in going down the journey and viewing it as a journey of exploration and learning.
Yeah. I like how you say that it's exploration, it's learning, and self-experimentation and finding out what's right for you, because you have the perfect history of someone with high cholesterol, familial hypercholesterolemia, a hyper-responder, who you could easily say, forget it, this is not the way for you. But yet, if you look a little more individually, you say, well, maybe there's something that you can get out of this that will make it worth it for you. And you're not going to get that from a textbook. You're not going to get that from a doctor who doesn't see people as individuals. So I think you're a perfect example for that. Thank you for sharing your story and for sharing all your knowledge with us today.
Thank you for having me.